Hey everyone! Tonight we're diving fork first into something that might surprise you. Ancient Rome, that grand empire of marble columns and conquering legions, had a serious junk food problem. And I mean serious. We're talking about a civilization that invented fast food chains 2,000 years before McDonald's, where you could grab a greasy snack on every street corner, and where the line between delicious and dangerous was parchment paper inner than pee. Before we journey back to those bustling Roman streets, take a moment to hit that like button if you're curious about history's weirdest food trends, and subscribe if you want more deep dives into the past. Drop a comment letting me know what time it is where you're watching and what ancient cuisine you'd be brave enough to try. Now settle in, maybe grab a snack of your own, and let's time travel to when street food could literally kill you. Picture this. You're stumbling through the narrow, crowded streets of ancient Rome on a sweltering afternoon. Your toga is sticking to your skin in all the wrong places. Your sandals are caked with mud and things you'd rather not identify, and your stomach is growling louder than the merchants hawking their wares. You've got a handful of bronze coins burning a hole in your purse, and you need food fast. Not a formal dinner with reclining couches and 7 courses. Not a sacrifice to the household gods, just something hot, filling, and immediately available. Welcome to the world of Roman junk food, where convenience came with a side of questionable hygiene and flavor combinations that would make modern food safety inspectors faint. This wasn't just about grabbing a quick bite. This was survival cuisine for an empire on the move, where millions of people needed feeding, and nobody had time for elaborate meal preparation. The heart of Rome's fast food empire was the Thermopolium, and these weren't quaint little cafes. Think of them as ancient Rome's answer to every corner store, food truck, and dive bar rolled into one chaotic, steaming operation. These establishments lined the streets of every major Roman city, with Pompeii alone boasting over 150 of them before Vesuvius buried the evidence in ash. The setup was deceptively simple, but brilliantly functional. Picture a marble or stone counter with circular holes cut into the surface, each hole containing a large earthenware pot called a dolium. These vessels held whatever was hot, edible, and hadn't gone completely rancid in the Mediterranean heat. No refrigeration, no health inspectors, no ingredients list posted on the wall. Just bubbling mystery stews, fried delicacies of uncertain origin, and the eternal question of whether that meat was actually what they claimed it was. The Thermopolium owners weren't particularly concerned with presentation or customer service. The goal was volume, speed, and profit. Workers would grab a ladle that had seen better days, possibly better decades, and scoop whatever you pointed at into a bowl or directly into your hands. Payment was immediate. Complaints were unwelcome, and if you got food poisoning, well, that was between you and the gods. But here's what made these places absolutely essential to Roman life. In a city where most people lived in cramped apartments called insulae, cooking facilities were either non-existent or dangerously primitive. Fire was a constant threat in wooden tenements, and many residents simply couldn't afford the fuel, cookware, or ingredients home cooking. The Thermopolium wasn't just convenient, it was necessary survival infrastructure for the urban masses. And the food they served was surprisingly diverse, if not always appetizing by modern standards. Lentil stews thick enough to stand a spoon dominated many menus, flavored with whatever herbs and spices the cook could afford. Chickpeas roasted until they resembled gravel were a popular finger food, salted heavily and served in clay bowls that doubled as projectiles, when the quality was particularly disappointing. Sausages of mysterious composition sizzled on small grills, their contents a carefully guarded secret that probably included parts of animals you'd never willingly consume. The real star of Roman street food was garum, the fermented fish sauce that appeared in, on, or near virtually everything edible in the empire. Imagine the strongest, most pungent fish sauce you've ever encountered. Then multiply that intensity by 10. This wasn't a subtle seasoning. It was a flavor assault that could wake the dead and probably preserve them too. Made by stuffing fish guts into clay pots, adding copious amounts of salt, and leaving the mixture to ferment in the sun for months, garum was simultaneously Rome's most beloved condiment and its greatest olfactory weapon. The production process was so aromatic that garum factories were legally banned from operating within city limits. Yet once bottled and aged, this liquid was more precious than wine to Roman cooks. They poured it over roasted nuts, mixed it into bread dough, and used it to transform even the blandest lentil mush into something with enough flavour to make your eyes water. Different grades existed, from the cheap stuff that could strip paint to premium versions aged longer than most gladiators survived in the arena. Street vendors didn't just serve garum, they weaponized it. A splash here, a drizzle there, and suddenly your handful of roasted chickpeas became an experience that would linger in your memory and on your breath for days. It was Rome's secret weapon against bland food, and absolutely nothing was safe from its influence. Now let's talk about the sweet side of Roman junk food, because even ancient people needed their sugar fix. Honey was the golden standard of sweetness, literally worth its weight in precious metals, and treated with the reverence modern people reserve for artisanal chocolate. But Romans didn't just drizzle honey on things, they weaponized it. Globuli were perhaps the most indulgent street treat you could find, and they were essentially ancient donuts with a Mediterranean twist. Picture balls of ricotta-style cheese mixed with flour, shaped by hand, and deep fried in bubbling oil until they achieved that perfect golden brown colour that signals either deliciousness or impending dental emergency. Then came the honey bath. Not a light drizzle or elegant glaze, but a full submersion that turned these cheese balls into sticky, sweet, molten hazards. Eating globuli required strategy, patience, and possibly protective clothing. Bite too eagerly and scalding cheese would launch in unpredictable directions, potentially taking out nearby customers or innocent bystanders. The honey coating acted like ancient superglue, bonding your fingers together and ensuring that the rest of your day would involve bees following you through the marketplace like tiny, persistent creditors. But Romans loved them precisely because they were excessive. This wasn't subtle sweetness. This was dessert as declaration of war against moderation. Wealthy citizens might enjoy them at dinner parties where servants would strategically place finger bowls, and the entertainment value of watching guests struggle with molten cheese was part of the evening's amusement. For the average Roman worker, stumbling across globuli was like finding treasure. Sweet, rich, and filling enough to count as a meal, they represented a rare moment of pure indulgence in lives that were otherwise focused on survival and civic duty. Sure, you might spend the next hour trying to unstick your hands from various surfaces, but that was a small price to pay for a taste of liquid joy. Honey cakes, known as libum, occupied a different category entirely. These weren't light, fluffy confections that would melt in your mouth. Roman honey cakes were dense, substantial creations that could double as building materials if the construction industry ever faced a shortage. Made from cheese, flour, and eggs mixed into a thick, almost concrete-like dough. They were shaped into loaves and baked on leaves, because apparently Romans believed everything improved with a touch of foliage. The transformation happened when they emerged from the oven and met their honey destiny. Not a light coating or tasteful drizzle, but a full drowning that turned each cake into a sticky, sweet monument to excess. The honey soaked through every possible surface, creating a dessert that was simultaneously satisfying and structurally challenging to consume. These cakes served multiple purposes in Roman society. They appeared at religious festivals as offerings to household gods, making breakfast pastry double as spiritual sacrifice. They were served at family gatherings, where their dense consistency guaranteed that even the hungriest relatives would be satisfied after a modest portion. and they became the subject of heated disputes when only one slice remained, because apparently some things never change across the centuries. The texture was, to put it diplomatically, substantial. Cutting required proper tools and considerable determination. Eating demanded strong jaw muscles and low expectations for dental comfort. But Romans adored them anyway, possibly because in a world where dessert options were limited and sugar was expensive, anything that combined sweetness with the ability to fill your stomach was worth celebrating. Rich families might add nuts, spices, or dried fruits to their honey cakes, creating versions that approached actual palatability. Poor families made do with whatever honey they could afford, and the quiet satisfaction of having something sweet to end their meal, even if that sweetness came with the texture of sweetened masonry. The strangest part might be how these dense, honey-soaked blocks became associated with comfort and celebration. They were what people remembered from childhood, what they craved during difficult times, and what they offered to guests as a gesture of hospitality. In a civilization that conquered half the known world through military precision and engineering excellence, their favorite dessert was essentially edible construction material, soaked in bee syrup. But that was Roman junk food in its essence. It wasn't about elegance or subtlety. It was about calories, convenience, and the occasional moment of sticky, sweet joy in lives that were often harsh and unpredictable. These foods fed an empire, sustained its workers, and somehow managed to be both practical and indulgent at the same time. And we're just getting started on this culinary journey through ancient Rome's strangest snacks. What we've covered so far is merely the appetizer course in Rome's bizarre relationship with fast food. The real adventure begins when we venture beyond the relatively tame world of honey cakes and cheese balls into territory that would make modern food safety inspectors reach for their emergency whistles. Because Romans didn't just push the boundaries of what constituted acceptable street food. They obliterated those boundaries entirely and then used the rubble to season their next meal. Let's start with something that sounds innocent enough. Roasted chickpeas. Now, before you picture a wholesome bowl of crunchy legumes, let me paint you the real picture. Roman chickpeas weren't the lightly seasoned, artfully roasted snacks you might find at a modern health food store. These were weapons disguised as food, roasted over open coals until they achieved the hardness and density of small stones, then salted with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for preserving entire sides of beef. Vendors would shout about their chickpeas from every street corner, competing for customers by claiming their particular batch could crack nuts, break teeth, or outlast the siege of Carthage. They were sold in clay bowls that frequently became part of the dining experience when desperate customers tried to use them as hammers to break apart particularly stubborn specimens. Children would practice their slingshot accuracy by launching failed chickpeas at passing senators, and more than one political career was probably ended by a well-aimed legume to the head. The Romans swore these concrete hard spheres were healthy, promoting everything from strong teeth to clear thinking, which sounds suspiciously like marketing copy written by someone who'd never actually tried to chew one. But they were cheap, they lasted forever, and they gave your jaw muscles a workout that would make modern fitness trainers weep with envy. Plus, in a pinch, they could double as ammunition, currency, or building materials for emergency home repairs. But chickpeas were practically gourmet compared to what passed for sausage in the average Roman street stall. Lucanica sausages were named after the region of Lucania, though by the time they reached the streets of Rome, their geographical origin was the least mysterious thing about them. These weren't carefully crafted links of premium meat seasoned with herbs and aged to perfection. They were more like edible lottery tickets, where you never quite knew what you were going to get until you bit down and hoped for the best. The official recipe called for pork, liver, lungs, and heart, seasoned with pepper, cumin, and fennel seeds. The unofficial reality involved whatever happened to be available, affordable, and hadn't yet achieved independent movement. Rumours circulated about donkey meat, dog parts, and organs that even experienced butchers couldn't identify with confidence. But the beauty of sausage making was that once everything was ground up, seasoned aggressively, and stuffed into intestinal casing, the mystery became part of the appeal. Street vendors would grill these sausages over small braziers, filling the air with smoke that was part appetizing aroma, part chemical warning system. The smell could attract customers from 3 blocks away or clear entire neighborhoods, depending on the freshness of the ingredients and the skill of the cook. Romans would line up with coins in hand and hope in their hearts, knowing that each sausage was essentially a gamble with their digestive system. Storage was optimistic at best. Without refrigeration, sausages aged like fine wine if you were lucky, or like biological warfare experiments if you weren't. Some achieved a hardness that rivaled Roman concrete, while others developed textures that defied description and occasionally seemed to pulse with their own mysterious life force. But Romans were pragmatic people. If it was cooked thoroughly enough and seasoned aggressively enough, they figured their stomachs could handle whatever challenges arose. The truly adventurous street food experience, however, was reserved for those brave enough to try the daily mystery stew at their local thermopolium. This wasn't a carefully planned recipe with measured ingredients and precise cooking times. This was whatever happened to be available that morning, thrown into a pot with enough garum to mask any questionable flavors, and cooked until it achieved a consistency somewhere between soup and mortar. The base might be lentils, beans, or grain, depending on what the cook could afford or what had fallen off the back of a merchant's cart. Vegetables appeared when available and disappeared when they developed their own ecosystems. Meat was added when possible, removed when it started moving, and replaced with whatever protein source happened to be wandering too close to the cooking pot. The beauty of mystery stew was its democratic nature. Rich and poor alike could enjoy the thrill of not knowing what they were eating until they were halfway through the bowl. Senators might add their own spices and pretend they were slumming it for the authentic experience. Laborers were just grateful for something hot that would keep them functional through another afternoon of hauling stones for the next triumphal arch. Some thermopolium owners developed reputations for their particular brand of culinary roulette. Marcus the Mad might be known for stews that could wake the dead, while Gaius the Gentle specialized in concoctions that merely induced mild hallucinations. Regular customers developed loyalties based on which establishments' mystery ingredients agreed best with their particular digestive constitution. But perhaps the most Roman approach to junk food was their relationship with bread, soaked in wine. This wasn't a sophisticated pairing of artisanal sourdough with a carefully selected vintage. This was survival breakfast for people who had run out of both time and options. Stale bread, the kind that could double as a doorstop, would be torn into chunks and drowned in whatever wine-like substance was available and affordable. The wine didn't need to be good. It didn't even need to be recognizably wine. Anything that had once contained grapes and had achieved some level of fermentation qualified for bread-soaking duty. The alcohol would soften the rock-hard bread just enough to make it chewable, while providing the kind of morning buzz that made facing another day in the empire seem almost tolerable. This was breakfast, lunch, dinner, and sometimes all three for Romans, who couldn't afford better options or couldn't be bothered with more elaborate meal preparation. Farmers ate it before heading to the fields. Laborers grabbed it between shifts, and philosophers consumed it while pondering the meaning of existence and wondering why their life choices had led them to eating alcoholic bread soup for breakfast. The wealthy, of course, mocked this practice while secretly indulging in their own versions, using aged wine and artisanal bread, served on proper plates by servants who were trained not to judge their employers' questionable morning meal choices. They called it rustic dining and pretended it connected them to the simple life of the common people, conveniently forgetting that common people ate wine-soaked bread because they had no other choice. And then there were the Romans who took street food to truly horrifying heights with their enthusiasm for fried fish parts. Not fillets, not carefully prepared portions, but the bits that modern people throw away or use for fertilizer. Fish heads, tails, fins, and anything small enough to toss whole into a pan of bubbling oil dominated the offerings at dockside food stalls. The cooking method was simple and terrifying, Heat oil until it was dangerously hot, throw in whatever sea creatures had the misfortune to end up in the net that morning, and fry everything until it stopped moving and achieved some level of crispiness. Seasoning consisted of salt, maybe a splash of vinegar if the vendor was feeling fancy, and always a generous application of garum, because apparently no Roman meal was complete without fermented fish sauce. The result was something that crunched when you bit it, though whether that crunch came from properly cooked fish or from the bones, scales, and miscellaneous sea debris was anybody's guess. These crispy maritime mysteries were wrapped in fig leaves if you were lucky, or handed directly to customers if hygiene was considered optional, which it usually was. Romans loved these crunchy sea creatures with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for gladiator matches and chariot races. They were salty, fatty, and provided enough texture variety to keep your jaw entertained for several minutes. The fact that you were essentially eating whatever the Mediterranean had coughed up that morning only added to the adventure. But the crown jewel of questionable Roman street food had to be their approach to what we might generously call aged cheese. Roman cheese wasn't just old, it was weaponized. Vendors would age their products until they achieved a pungency that could clear crowds and a hardness that made them suitable for construction projects. Some varieties were aged until they were more salt than dairy, others until they developed their own weather systems. These cheese blocks were sold by vendors who had long since lost their sense of smell and their concern for customer satisfaction. They were marketed as delicacies, health foods, and occasionally as industrial solvents, depending on the customer's needs and level of desperation. Romans would scrape bits off with knives, add them to bread, or sometimes just gnaw on them directly, like particularly aromatic rocks. The smell was legendary. Roman aged cheese could announce its presence from several city blocks away, causing pedestrians to change their routes and small animals to relocate to different neighborhoods. But Romans had developed impressive tolerance for olfactory assault, probably from years of living downwind from garum factories and public latrines. Here's what makes all of this absolutely fascinating. Despite the questionable hygiene, mysterious ingredients, and aggressive flavoring, Roman street food was the backbone of urban civilization. It fed the masses, fueled the workforce, and somehow managed to keep an empire running on a diet that would horrify modern nutritionists and thrill modern extreme food enthusiasts. The sheer variety was staggering. You could walk through any major Roman city and encounter dozens of different ways to risk your digestive system, each one representing centuries of culinary evolution, economic necessity, and the eternal human desire to eat something that tastes good, fills your stomach, and doesn't require you to cook it yourself. And perhaps most remarkably, this wasn't considered weird or extreme by Roman standards. This was just Tuesday afternoon in the Empire, where grabbing a handful of concrete hard chickpeas and a mystery sausage of questionable origin was as normal as stopping by Starbucks for a latte in our modern world. But we haven't even touched on the truly bizarre corners of Roman snacking culture yet. Because what we've covered so far represents the mainstream, everyday junk food that kept regular Romans fed and functioning. The really strange stuff was reserved for special occasions, wealthy patrons, and people who had completely given up on the concept of food safety. Now, if you thought aged cheese and mystery fish parts were pushing the boundaries of acceptable dining, wait until you hear about what the Roman elite considered the height of sophisticated snacking. Because when you had enough money to buy anything you wanted, apparently what you wanted was small, furry creatures that most people would consider pets. Enter the dormouse, or as the Romans called them, glyers. These weren't just any dormice either. These were specially fattened dormice raised in clay pots called gleraria, which were essentially luxury mouse hotels designed to produce the plumpest, most tender rodents money could buy. The Romans had turned small mammal farming into an art form, complete with regulations, breeding techniques, and probably heated debates about which regions produced the finest specimens. The preparation process was exactly as unsettling as you might imagine. These well-fed little creatures would be stuffed with minced pork, nuts, and herbs, then roasted until golden brown and served whole at elegant dinner parties. Guests would delicately pick them up by their tiny tails and consume them like ancient chicken wings, except smaller, furrier, and infinitely more disturbing to modern sensibilities. But here's the thing that really captures the Roman mindset. This wasn't considered weird or cruel by their standards. It was considered refined. Serving dormice at your dinner party was like serving caviar and champagne today. It said you had money, taste, and access to the finer things in life. The fact that those finer things happened to be stuffed rodents was simply a matter of cultural perspective. The wealthy would compete over who could serve the most elaborate dormouse preparations. Some were honey-glazed until they looked like tiny, furry pastries. Others were seasoned with exotic spices imported from the far reaches of the empire. A few ambitious chefs would arrange them in artistic displays, creating edible sculptures that probably gave dinner guests nightmares for weeks. And surprisingly, dormouse farming was a legitimate industry with its own economic ecosystem. Professional dormouse breeders, specialized glaciaria manufacturers, and dormouse merchants all made their living from this bizarre luxury food market. It was regulated by law, taxed by the government, and considered such an essential part of elite dining that losing access to quality dormice could damage your social standing. Of course, your average Roman worker wasn't munching on stuffed dormice during their lunch break. They were dealing with more pedestrian challenges, like figuring out whether that sausage vendor had bothered to cook his products all the way through, or whether the chickpeas at the corner stall had achieved sufficient hardness to qualify as weapons. But even among the common street foods, Romans found ways to push the boundaries of what seemed advisable to eat. Take their approach to what we might call leftover cuisine. Nothing went to waste in ancient Rome. And I mean nothing. Bread that had achieved the consistency of marble would be soaked in vinegar until it resembled edible mush. Meat that had started developing its own ecosystem would be chopped up, heavily spiced, and mixed into stews, where individual ingredients became unidentifiable. The Romans had an entire category of food called renewed dishes, where yesterday's disasters became today's specials through the liberal application of seasonings, heat, and optimism. A piece of fish that had begun its journey toward becoming a biological weapon could be transformed into a delicacy with enough garum, herbs, and the kind of cooking temperature that would sterilize surgical instruments. Street vendors became masters of culinary resurrection, turning ingredients that should have been buried into meals that somehow sustained an empire. They developed techniques that modern food scientists would find both fascinating and terrifying. Fermentation processes that bordered on controlled decomposition. Preservation methods that relied more on salt concentration than actual preservation. And flavor combinations that could mask the taste of nearly anything. But perhaps the most uniquely Roman approach to snacking was their relationship with what they called drinking food. This wasn't just wine with a side of nuts. Romans had developed an entire category of foods specifically designed to be consumed while drinking, and the combinations were as creative as they were potentially lethal. Imagine trying to maintain a serious political conversation while navigating a plate of honey-soaked cheese balls that threaten to glue your mouth shut, or attempting to look dignified while wrestling with a chunk of aged cheese that could double as a doorstop. Roman social drinking involved foods that were simultaneously delicious and structurally challenging, requiring considerable skill to consume without embarrassing yourself in front of your fellow citizens. They had olives stuffed with everything from nuts to small fish, creating bite-sized flavor bombs that could explode in your mouth with unexpected intensity. Pickled vegetables that had been preserved in solutions strong enough to etch marble provided the kind of acidic punch that could wake you up instantly or potentially dissolve your tongue, depending on the vendor's preservation philosophy. And then there were the Romans who took their love of fermented fish sauce to truly excessive heights by creating solid foods that were essentially garum delivery systems. Imagine crackers made primarily of dried fish paste, or what we might generously call fish cookies, that existed solely to transport as much fermented seafood flavour as possible directly to your taste buds. These weren't subtle flavour enhancers. They were edible assault weapons designed to overwhelm every other taste in your mouth and linger in your memory for days. Romans would munch on them between sips of wine, creating flavour combinations that would probably violate several modern international treaties on chemical warfare. But here's what made Roman junk food culture truly remarkable. It worked. Somehow, this chaotic collection of mystery ingredients, aggressive seasonings, and questionable preparation methods managed to feed one of history's most successful civilizations. Roman street food wasn't just sustenance. It was the fuel that powered legions, built aqueducts, and conquered continents. The efficiency was staggering. In a city like Rome, with over 1 million residents, the street food network could feed vast numbers of people quickly, cheaply, and with enough variety to prevent complete dietary monotony. Workers could grab breakfast on their way to construction sites, soldiers could stock up on portable rations, and citizens could satisfy their cravings without the time and expense of formal meal preparation. And despite all the questionable hygiene and mysterious ingredients, Romans lived long enough to build an empire that lasted centuries. Their immune systems were apparently forged in the fires of fermented fish sauce and aged to perfection through exposure to every possible form of culinary adventure. The social aspect was equally important. Roman street food wasn't just about individual consumption, it was about community. Thermopolia served as informal social clubs where news was shared, deals were made, and relationships were formed over bowls of mystery stew. The shared experience of surviving questionable sausages created bonds that helped hold Roman society together. Even the wealthy, despite their access to elaborate feasts and exotic delicacies, would occasionally venture into the world of street food for the thrill of culinary danger and the satisfaction of proving they could handle whatever the common people were eating. It was democratically dangerous food that could humble anyone, regardless of social status. But the most fascinating aspect might be how Roman junk food reflected the empire's approach to everything else. Practical, efficient, and uttered with anyoneally unconk else's opinion about how things should be done. If it worked, it was good enough. If it could feed people quickly and cheaply, the details were negotiable. If it tasted good enough to keep customers coming back, questions about ingredients were discouraged. This pragmatic approach to food safety would horrify modern health inspectors, but it created a food culture that was remarkably resilient and adaptable. Roman street vendors could work with whatever ingredients were available, adjust their recipes based on supply and demand, and create new dishes on the spot, using whatever combination of leftovers, spices, and creativity they could muster. The result was a constantly evolving menu of culinary experiments, where today's disaster might become tomorrow's signature dish, and where the only consistent element was the guarantee that you'd never be completely sure what you were eating until you'd finished it. And speaking of never being completely sure what you were eating, we need to talk about Roman attitudes toward food storage and the creative ways they dealt with the challenges of keeping perishables edible in a world without refrigeration. Because Romans didn't just accept that food would spoil, they developed an entire philosophy around incorporating various stages of decomposition into their dining experience. The Roman approach to food storage was less preserve the freshness and more delay the inevitable while adding interesting flavors along the way. They understood that without ice or mechanical refrigeration, their relationship with food would necessarily involve negotiating with various stages of decay, fermentation, and what we might politely call enhanced ripening. Take their famous aged meats, which weren't just old, they were archaeological specimens. Roman butchers would hang cuts of meat in well-ventilated spaces, sometimes for months, allowing them to develop crusts that could serve as natural packaging. The outside would become hard enough to chip teeth, while the inside supposedly remained tender and flavorful. Whether this actually worked or whether Romans had simply convinced themselves that extremely expensive, extremely old meat must be delicious, is a question that probably kept ancient food critics awake at night. But the real innovation came in their approach to what modern people would consider spoiled food. Romans had an entire vocabulary for different stages of food deterioration, and many of these stages were considered not just edible, but desirable. Cheese that had developed its own weather patterns wasn't thrown away. It was celebrated as aged perfection. Fish that had achieved independent movement wasn't discarded. It was transformed through aggressive cooking and seasoning into a delicacy that supposedly promoted health and longevity. This philosophy extended to their street food in ways that would make modern food safety experts weep. Thermopolium owners would keep their stews bubbling for days, adding new ingredients to pots that had been continuously cooking since the reign of previous emperors. The theory was that the constant heat would kill anything dangerous, while the accumulated flavors would create depth and complexity that couldn't be achieved through normal cooking methods. The reality was probably closer to biological warfare disguised as lunch, but Romans seemed to thrive on it. They developed iron stomachs and immune systems that could handle whatever their creative food preservation methods threw at them, literally and figuratively. And then there were the Roman drinking snacks that pushed the boundaries of what could be considered food rather than industrial solvent. They had nuts pickled in solutions so acidic they could strip paint, olives preserved in brines that doubled as cleaning products, and dried fruits that had been treated with enough salt to preserve them through multiple ice ages. These weren't subtle accompaniments to wine. They were flavor nuclear weapons designed to complement the equally aggressive Roman approach to fermented beverages. A handful of these super preserved snacks could change the entire chemistry of your mouth, creating taste experiences that ranged from transcendent to traumatic, often within the same mouthful. But perhaps most remarkably, Romans had figured out how to make street food that was simultaneously portable, durable, and capable of providing enough calories to fuel manual labor in Mediterranean heat. Their solutions might seem insane by modern standards, but they worked well enough to sustain urban populations that wouldn't be matched in Europe for over 1,000 years after Rome's fall. The secret was their willingness to embrace controlled chaos in their food system. Instead of trying to eliminate all variables and create perfectly consistent products, Romans learned to work with uncertainty, variability, and the occasional complete disaster. This made their food culture incredibly resilient and adaptable, capable of functioning even when supply chains broke down, ingredients became unavailable, or entire regions were disrupted by war or natural disaster. Roman street food vendors were essentially culinary survivalists, capable of creating edible meals, them taste goo from whatever materials were available, and making enough that people would pay for the privilege of eating them. They were masters of improvisation, experts at disguising questionable ingredients, and artists at creating flavors so intense they could overwhelm any concerns about food safety. And somehow, miraculously, this chaotic system worked well enough to feed an empire that stretched from Britain to North Africa, from Spain to Syria. Roman junk food wasn't just a curiosity, it was one of the logistical achievements that made Roman civilization possible. But there's one more aspect of Roman street food culture that might be the strangest of all: their complete lack of embarrassment about any of it. Modern people might try to hide their consumption of questionable fast food, but Romans celebrated it. They wrote poems about their favorite sausage vendors, commissioned artwork depicting elaborate feasts featuring mystery stews, and treated to consume the most challenging street foods as a mark of cultural sophistication. In a civilization that gave us architectural marvels, legal systems, and military strategies that are still studied today, some of their proudest achievements were apparently related to their ability to make delicious snacks out of ingredients that shouldn't technically qualify as food. And that might be the most Roman thing of all: taking something that should be impossible applying enough confidence and creativity to make it work, and then acting like it was obvious all along. Whether they were building roads across mountain ranges or turning fermented fish guts into a condiment that would define their cuisine for centuries, Romans approached challenges with the same basic philosophy. If it can be done, we'll figure out how to do it, and we'll probably make it taste better than anyone expects. Their junk food culture wasn't just about feeding people efficiently, it was about proving that with enough ingenuity, determination, and willingness to experiment with questionable ingredients, you could create something that was simultaneously practical and surprisingly enjoyable. And perhaps that's the real legacy of Roman street food. Not the specific recipes or preparation methods, but the attitude that food should be an adventure, that eating should involve some element of risk and discovery, and that the best meals often come from the most unlikely combinations of ingredients and circumstances. Because ultimately, Roman junk food culture was about more than just grabbing a quick bite between gladiator matches. It was about unique, and the community, identity-ly, Roman belief that life should be lived boldly, even when that boldness involved eating things that might fight back. The social hierarchy of Roman snacking tells us as much about their society as any political treatise or military history. While slaves and freedmen lined up at Thermopylae for their daily rations of lentil stew and mystery sausage, the wealthy were developing their own elaborate traditions around what they considered refined snacking. But Roman class distinctions in food weren't as clear-cut as you might expect. Yes, the rich had access to imported delicacies and exotic ingredients that common people could never afford. They snacked on dates stuffed with almonds and drizzled with honey from Mount Hymettus, or nibbled on pine nuts imported from distant forests. But here's the twist. They also regularly ventured into the world of street food, not out of necessity, but out of genuine appreciation for the craft. Wealthy Romans would sometimes disguise themselves and visit the grittiest Thermopylae, not to mock the common people, but to experience what they considered the authentic flavors of Roman life. They understood that the best sausage makers weren't necessarily working in the fanciest establishments, and that the most skilled cooks often operated from the humblest stalls. This created a unique food culture where social mixing happened naturally around shared appreciation for well-prepared snacks, regardless of their humble origins. A senator might find himself standing next to a construction worker, both waiting for the same vendor's legendary fried chickpeas, both willing to risk their dental health for that perfect combination of salt, crunch, and nostalgic satisfaction. But the real democratizing force in Roman snacking was wine. Not the expensive, aged vintages that appeared at formal dinners, but the everyday stuff that flowed like water through Roman society. This wasn't necessarily high-quality wine either. Much of what Romans drank would probably qualify as vinegar by modern standards, but it served multiple crucial functions in their food culture. Wine made questionable water safe to drink, which was essential in cities where public health infrastructure was still evolving. It preserved foods that might otherwise spoil in Mediterranean heat. And most importantly for our story, it created an entire category of wine-soaked snacks that became central to Roman social life. Romans would soak everything in wine. Stale bread became a legitimate breakfast when drowned in cheap wine and eaten with a spoon. Hard cheese became manageable when softened in wine mixed with honey. Even vegetables that had seen better days could be revived through strategic wine application and aggressive seasoning. This wasn't just about making bad food edible, though that was certainly part of it. Wine-soaked snacks became a social ritual, a way of transforming individual eating into communal experience. Groups would gather around bowls of wine-soaked bread, sharing food that required no cooking, no plates, and no formal preparation. It was democratic dining at its most basic level. The technique also solved practical problems for people living in cramped urban apartments where cooking was difficult or dangerous. You could prepare an entire meal using nothing more than wine, stale bread, and whatever preserved foods you could afford. No fire required, no expensive cookware needed. Just the will diningingness to embrace an experience that prioritized efficiency over elegance. But Romans being Romans, they found ways to elevate even this humble approach to dining. Wealthy households developed sophisticated variations using aged wines, artisanal breads, and carefully selected accompaniments. They created what we might call rustic chic dining experiences, where the simplicity was carefully curated and the humble ingredients were chosen for their authenticity rather than their affordability. Poor Romans, meanwhile, were just grateful for something that would fill their stomachs and provide enough alcohol to make their daily struggles feel manageable. They weren't making aesthetic choices about their wine-soaked bread survival choices. They were making, but somehow, both approaches resulted in food that people genuinely enjoyed and remembered fondly. Now, let's talk about Roman attitudes toward what we might politely call adventurous protein sources. Because while dormice were shocking enough, they were just the beginning of Roman willingness to eat things that would make modern people call animal control. Romans had a philosophical approach to meat that was both practical and slightly terrifying. If it had once been alive and could be caught, killed and cooked, it was potentially food. This wasn't desperation eating. It was culinary curiosity taken to extremes that would impress modern extreme food enthusiasts and horrify everyone else. They ate flamingo tongues, not because they were particularly delicious, but because they were rare and difficult to obtain. They consumed peacock brains, ostrich eggs, and the wombs of pregnant sows. They turned songbirds into delicacies and made entire meals from various internal organs that modern butchers discard without a second thought. But the street food version of this adventurous eating was both more democratic and somehow more disturbing. Common Romans couldn't afford exotic birds or imported delicacies, but they could access the leftover parts of common animals that more squeamish customers rejected. Sausage vendors would stuff casings with everything from pig's blood to chopped lungs, creating protein sources that were nutritious, affordable, and completely unidentifiable once they'd been seasoned and grilled. Blood pudding wasn't just a food, it was a philosophical statement about waste reduction and practical nutrition that happened to taste surprisingly good when prepared correctly. Roman street cooks became masters of organ meat preparation, turning hearts, livers, kidneys, and stranger parts into snacks that were actually appealing to people who hadn't been raised to be disgusted by the idea of eating them. They understood seasoning, cooking techniques, and presentation in ways that could make almost anything palatable. The key was their approach to flavor. Romans didn't try to hide what they were eating or make it taste like something else. Instead, they used spices, herbs, and sauces to enhance the natural flavors while creating combinations that were genuinely delicious rather than merely tolerable. Take their approach to what we might call enhanced preservation. Romans understood that certain types of controlled decomposition could actually improve flavors rather than destroying them. They aged meats until they developed complex, concentrated tastes that couldn't be achieved through normal cooking. They fermented vegetables until they became sour, salty explosions of umami that could wake up your entire mouth. This wasn't accidental spoilage they were trying to disguise. This was intentional fermentation and aging designed to create specific flavor profiles that Romans genuinely preferred to fresher alternatives. They had developed palates that appreciated intensity, complexity, and what we might call challenging tastes. Their fish sauce culture alone demonstrates this perfectly. Garum wasn't just a condiment, it was a flavor philosophy. Romans believed that the most intense possible fish flavor, concentrated through months of fermentation, was superior to the subtle taste of fresh fish. They wanted their food to announce itself boldly, to create memorable experiences that lingered long after the meal ended. This extended to their approach to vegetables, which Romans transformed through pickling, fermentation, and preservation techniques that created snacks with shocking intensity. pickled onions that could make your eyes water from across the room, preserved olives so salty they could be used for currency, fermented cabbage that had achieved its own ecosystem of flavors. These weren't failed attempts at preservation, they were successful attempts at flavor enhancement. Romans had figured out how to use time salt, decom, and control position as cooking techniques, creating foods that were simultaneously preserved and improved through the aging process. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Roman snack culture was their approach to seasonal eating. Unlike modern people who expect the same foods to be available year-round, Romans embraced the rhythm of seasons and created different snacking traditions for different times of year. Summer brought fresh fruits that were eaten immediately or preserved through drying, honey coating, or wine soaking for later consumption. Grapes weren't just turned into wine, they were dried into raisins, cooked into syrups, or fermented into various alcoholic preserves that could provide sweetness and intoxication throughout the winter months. Autumn was the season for nuts, which Romans prepared in dozens of different ways. Roasted with salt, honey glazed, pickled in vinegar, or ground into pastes that could be spread on bread or mixed into other dishes. They understood that nuts provided essential fats and proteins that would be crucial during colder months when fresh foods were scarce. Winter brought the preserved foods that had been prepared during warmer seasons, but Romans found ways to make these stored foods feel fresh and exciting. They would combine preserved ingredients in new ways, creating winter snacks that were different from what had been available during harvest season. Spring was the season of renewal, when Romans would celebrate the return of fresh foods, with festivals and feasts that marked the end of winter's preserved diet. But even then, they would incorporate their preserved foods into the celebrations, creating dishes that combined fresh and aged ingredients in ways that highlighted the unique qualities of both. This seasonal approach to eating created a food culture that was constantly changing, always offering something new to look forward to and deeply connected to the natural rhythms of the Mediterranean climate. Romans didn't just eat seasonally out of necessity, they celebrated seasonality as part of what made their food culture rich and varied. And here's where Roman snack culture becomes truly remarkable. They managed to create a food system that was simultaneously practical and indulgent, efficient and adventurous, democratic and sophisticated. Street food wasn't just fuel for the masses, it was a parallel cuisine that existed alongside formal dining and often surpassed it in creativity and flavour. Roman cooks working from thermopolia and street stalls were innovating constantly, experimenting with new combinations, adapting to available ingredients, and responding to customer preferences in ways that created a dynamic, evolving food culture. They weren't just following ancient recipes, they were writing new ones every day based on what worked, what tasted good, and what people would pay for. This created a food culture that was remarkably resilient and adaptable. When trade routes were disrupted, Roman cooks found local alternatives. When traditional ingredients became unavailable, they experimented with substitutes. When customer tastes changed, vendors adjusted their offerings accordingly. The result was a snack culture that could survive invasions, economic disruptions, natural disasters, and political upheavals. As long as there were people who needed to eat quickly and cheaply, there would be Roman entrepreneurs ready to provide creative solutions using whatever materials were available. But what really made Roman junk food special wasn't just its practicality or even its surprising tastiness. It was the attitude behind it. The Roman belief that food should be an adventure, that eating should involve some element of risk and discovery, and that the best experiences often come from the most unexpected combinations of ingredients and circumstances. Romans approached their street food with the same confidence and ambition they brought to conquering territories and building monuments. They weren't content with boring, safe, predictable snacks. They wanted foods that would surprise them, challenge them, and create memories worth sharing with friends and fellow citizens. This attitude created a food culture where innovation was encouraged, experimentation was celebrated, and failure was just another step toward discovering something amazing. Roman street food vendors weren't just feeding people. They were entertaining them, educating them about new flavors, and constantly pushing the boundaries of what food could be. And perhaps most importantly, they were creating a shared cultural experience that helped bind together one of history's most diverse and far-flung empires. Whether you were eating mystery stew in Rome or honey-soaked cheese balls in Alexandria, you were participating in a food culture that connected you to millions of other Romans who shared your willingness to take culinary risks and your appreciation for bold flavors. The legacy of Roman junk food isn't just about specific recipes or cooking techniques, though those are fascinating enough. It's about an approach to food that valued adventure over safety, intensity over subtlety, and community over individual dining. Romans understood that sharing questionable sausages and surviving mystery stews created bonds between people that formal dinner parties could never match. They also understood that food culture could be both high and low simultaneously, that street snacks could be just as sophisticated and meaningful as elaborate banquet dishes, and that the best culinary experiences often happened in the most unexpected places with the most unlikely ingredients. And here's the final twist that makes Roman junk food culture truly remarkable. Despite all the questionable hygiene, mysterious ingredients, and aggressive flavoring, despite the lack of refrigeration, food safety regulations, or modern preservation techniques, Romans created a street food culture that was not only successful, but genuinely beloved by the people who experienced it. They didn't just tolerate their challenging snacks, they celebrated them. They wrote about them fondly, recommended their favorite vendors to friends, and created traditions around foods that modern people would probably find completely unacceptable. Somehow, through sheer force of culinary creativity and cultural confidence, they turned what should have been a disaster into one of history's most vibrant and successful food cultures. Roman junk food proves that great cuisine isn't about perfect ingredients, ideal conditions, or foolproof techniques. It's about understanding your audience, working with what you have available, and never being afraid to try something that might seem impossible. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very Roman, you might just create something that people will still be talking about 2,000 years later. But even with all this culinary chaos, we haven't touched on what might be the most revealing aspect of Roman snack culture, how they dealt with hangovers. And trust me, in a civilization where watered wine was considered a health drink and public festivals regularly devolved into citywide drinking competitions, hangover food was serious business. The morning after a particularly enthusiastic celebration at the baths or a neighbour's wedding, Romans didn't reach for coffee and aspirin. They reached for what they called restoration foods. And these remedies were about as appetizing as they sound. The most popular hangover cure was a concoction that would make modern partygoers weep. Raw eggs stirred into spiced wine, creating a slippery alcoholic protein shake that was supposed to restore your humours and get you functional enough to face another day of civic duty. But that was just the beginning. Serious hangover sufferers would visit specialised vendors who sold what we might generously call recovery snacks. Pickled cabbage so sour it could wake the dead, served alongside chunks of stale bread soaked in vinegar and oil. The theory was that the acidity would cut through whatever was making your head pound, while the bread would absorb any remaining alcohol sloshing around in your system. And then there were the truly desperate remedies. Fried silphium, an expensive herb from North Africa that was supposed to cure everything from indigestion to lovesickness. Raw garlic cloves eaten whole, because apparently Romans believed that if you could survive the garlic, you could survive anything. And for those who could afford it, imported ginger mixed with honey and wine, creating a sweet, spicy paste that was either medicine or punishment, depending on your perspective. The wealthy had their own elaborate hangover traditions, involving servants who would prepare special broths made from exotic ingredients and served in precious vessels. But even the rich occasionally stumbled down to the nearest thermopolium, looking for the kind of greasy, salty comfort food that could only be found at street level. There was something democratic about hangovers that made everyone equal in their suffering and their desperate search for relief. Now, let's talk about something that would absolutely horrify modern food safety inspectors. Roman attitudes toward meat that had achieved what we might diplomatically call enhanced ripeness. Romans didn't just tolerate slightly off meat, they developed sophisticated techniques for determining exactly how far gone something could be before it crossed the line from aged to dangerous. Professional meat vendors would hang cuts in their stalls for days or weeks, developing a kind of controlled decomposition that supposedly improved flavor and tenderness. Customers would actually seek out meat that had developed a particular aroma or color, believing that this aging process created superior taste. The key was understanding the difference between meat that was properly aged and meat that was genuinely spoiled, a skill that separated experienced Roman diners from tourists who ended up spending their vacation worshipping at the temple of Cloetina, goddess of sewers. This expertise extended to fish vendors, who developed an entire vocabulary for describing different stages of fish freshness. There was fresh, which was eaten immediately. There was ripe, which had developed stronger flavors and was considered ideal for certain preparations. There was enhanced, which required aggressive cooking and seasoning, but was still considered edible. And then there was transformed, which was either turned into fish sauce or used to clear crowds from public spaces. Romans became connoisseurs of controlled spoilage, developing palates that could appreciate subtleties of decay that would send modern people running for the nearest bathroom. They understood fermentation, aging, and preservation in ways that allowed them to extract maximum nutrition and flavor from ingredients that other cultures might have discarded. But the real artistry came in disguising questionable ingredients through creative preparation and aggressive seasoning. A piece of meat that had seen better days could be minced, spiced, and formed into sausage that was not only edible, but genuinely delicious. Fish that had started developing its own personality could be transformed into a sauce so flavorful that people would fight over the last drops. This wasn't just about making the best of bad situations, though that was certainly part of it. Romans had genuinely developed a preference for intense, complex flavors that could only be achieved through aging, fermentation, and what we might call aggressive ripening. They wanted their food to have character, to tell a story, to create memorable experiences that lingered long after the meal ended. And speaking of memorable experiences, let's dive into the world of Roman festival foods, where normal rules of dietary restraint were suspended and street vendors competed to create the most outrageous snacks imaginable. During major festivals like Saturnalia or the Ides of Mars, the streets would fill with temporary food stalls selling treats that appeared nowhere else during the year. These weren't just regular street foods with festival decorations. These were specially created confections that pushed the boundaries of what Romans considered edible, even by their flexible standards. Honey-glazed dormice shaped like tiny gladiators. Sausages stuffed with exotic spices and wrapped in gold leaf for customers who wanted to literally eat money. Cakes shaped like miniature amphitheaters, complete with edible gladiators made from marzipan and food coloring. Festival foods were where Roman creativity and excess collided in spectacular fashion. Vendors would spend months preparing for major celebrations, developing recipes that would create buzz, attract customers, and hopefully avoid killing anyone in the process. The competition was fierce, with successful festival vendors earning enough during a few days of celebration to support themselves for months. But the real innovation came in creating foods that were simultaneously shocking and delicious. Romans loved being surprised by their food, and festival vendors delivered surprises that ranged from delightful to deeply disturbing. Pastries filled with live birds that would fly out when cut open, cakes that changed color when exposed to wine, sausages that contained mystery ingredients revealed only after you'd finished eating them. The wealthy would sometimes sponsor elaborate food competitions during festivals, offering prizes for the most creative, most disgusting, or most expensive snack. These contests would draw vendors from across the empire, creating temporary food festivals that showcased regional specialties and local innovations. Winners could earn enough money to retire, while losers might find themselves banned from future festivals or occasionally fed to exotic animals, depending on how seriously the judges took their culinary responsibilities. Now here's where Roman snack culture gets truly fascinating from a social perspective: the role of food in Roman courtship and romance. Because apparently, nothing said, "I find you attractive," like sharing a bowl of fermented fish sauce or offering someone a bite of your particularly ripe cheese. Romans had developed elaborate rituals around shared eating that were part social bonding, part romantic signaling, and part survival test. Couples would share snacks that required trust, skill, and strong stomachs to consume safely. Successfully navigating a meal of questionable sausages and aged delicacies together was apparently considered proof of compatibility and mutual affection. Young men would court potential wives by bringing them exotic snacks from distant markets, demonstrating both their wealth and their willingness to risk food poisoning for love. Young women would show their domestic skills by preparing complex preserved foods that could last through long engagements and demonstrate their to manage household resources effectively. But the real romantic test came with shared wine drinking and the associated snacks that accompanied serious drinking sessions. Couples who could maintain intelligent conversation while navigating honey-soaked cheese balls and pickled delicacies were apparently considered ideal matches. The logic was that if you could handle Roman drinking food together, you could handle anything marriage might throw at you. This created a courtship culture where food compatibility was considered as important as social status or family connections. Roman parents would evaluate potential matches partly based on their children's ability to consume challenging foods gracefully and their willingness to experiment with new and potentially dangerous culinary experiences. And then there were the professional food tasters, a job category that existed because wealthy Romans were paranoid about poison, but still wanted to enjoy the most exotic and dangerous foods available. These brave individuals would sample everything before their employers ate it, risking their lives daily to ensure that the wealthy could indulge in culinary adventures without fatal consequences. Food tasters developed incredible palates and intimate knowledge of ingredients, seasonings, and preparation techniques. They could identify not just whether food was safe to eat, but where ingredients came from, how they'd been prepared, and what effects they might have on the consumer. Some became celebrities in their own right, renowned for their ability to detect subtle flavors and their miraculous survival rates, despite consuming the most questionable delicacies in the empire. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Roman food culture was how they managed to turn eating into a form of entertainment that rivaled gladiator matches and chariot races. Public eating competitions would draw crowds who came to watch professional eaters consume impossible quantities of challenging foods. These weren't just displays of gluttony, they were athletic events that required training, strategy, and what we might call competitive digestion. Champions would specialize in particular types of food challenges. Some focused on quantity, seeing how many sausages or honey cakes they could consume in a limited time. Others specialized in surviving the most dangerous or disgusting foods available, building reputations for their ability to eat anything without visible distress. A few became famous for their speed, consuming elaborate meals faster than seemed humanly possible. These competitions created a whole category of professional entertainers who traveled from city to city, challenging local eating champions and putting on shows that combined athletic prowess with culinary daredevilry. Winners could earn prize money, sponsorship deals, and celebrity status that lasted for years. Losers might find themselves banned from future competitions or occasionally requiring medical attention from temple physicians. The crowds would bet on outcomes, cheer for favorites, and sometimes participate in eating challenges themselves. These events became social gatherings that brought together people from all social classes, united by their fascination with the spectacle of competitive consumption and their appreciation for anyone brave enough to risk their digestive system for public entertainment. But what really made Roman eating competitions special was how they reflected broader Roman values: the celebration of excess, the admiration for people who could survive impossible challenges, and the belief that entertainment should involve real risk and genuine skill. These weren't scripted performances. They were authentic tests of human endurance and digestive fortitude. And here's something that would probably shock modern nutritionists. Romans had developed their own theories about healthy eating that were based on balancing different types of excess rather than avoiding them entirely. They believed that consuming intensely flavored foods in moderation was healthier than eating bland foods in large quantities. Their logic was that strong flavors would satisfy your appetite more quickly, preventing overeating and promoting better digestion. This led to dietary advice that sounds insane by modern standards, but apparently worked well enough to sustain a civilization for centuries. Roman physicians would recommend eating small amounts of fermented fish sauce to promote stomach health. They prescribed aged cheeses for people with digestive problems. They suggested wine-soaked foods for anyone suffering from what they called weak humours. The theory was that your body needed to be challenged and stimulated by intense flavours in order to function properly. Bland, mild foods were considered unhealthy because they didn't provide enough stimulation to keep your digestive system working efficiently. This created a medical culture where doctors would actually prescribe the kinds of foods that modern physicians would consider dangerous. Roman athletes followed training diets that included foods designed to be challenging to digest, believing that this would strengthen their stomachs and improve their overall physical resilience. Gladiators ate special combinations of preserved foods, fermented beverages, and aged meats that were supposed to enhance their fighting ability and help them recover from injuries more quickly. Even Roman children were fed progressively more challenging foods as they grew up, starting with mild versions of adult foods and gradually working up to full-strength garum, aged cheeses, and mystery sausages. The idea was to build digestive strength gradually, like training any other muscle system. This approach to nutrition created a population with genuinely different digestive capabilities than modern people. Romans could handle foods that would hospitalize contemporary diners, not because they were genetically different, but because they'd been systematically trained from childhood to process intense flavors and challenging ingredients. Now, as we wrap up this culinary journey through ancient Rome's most questionable dining establishments, here's perhaps the most surprising twist of all. Archaeologists have recently discovered evidence that Romans were actually much more health conscious about their street food than we originally thought. Excavations at Pompeii have revealed thermopolia with surprisingly sophisticated food storage systems, including underground cooling chambers and elaborate drainage systems designed to keep ingredients fresh longer than previously possible. They've also found evidence of what appear to be ancient food safety regulations, including official seals on containers and standardized measurements for portions. Some vendors apparently specialized in what we might call health food, offering alternatives to the greasiest, most dangerous street snacks for customers who wanted convenience without quite as much risk. But perhaps most remarkably, chemical analysis of residues found in Roman cooking pots suggests that many of these seemingly crazy food combinations were actually nutritionally balanced in ways that provided essential vitamins, minerals, and proteins that would have been difficult to obtain otherwise. Those mystery stews weren't just random ingredients thrown together. They were carefully formulated meals designed to provide complete nutrition using whatever was available and affordable. The Romans, it turns out, were food scientists disguised as reckless party animals. They'd figured out how to create a street food culture that could feed millions of people efficiently, safely, and with enough variety and flavor to keep everyone coming back for more. Their methods might seem insane by modern standards, but the results speak for themselves. They built and sustained one of history's most successful civilizations, partly through the power of really good junk food. So the next time you're debating whether to trust that questionable food truck or wondering if that corner deli is worth the risk, just remember, you're participating in a tradition that goes back over 2,000 years, to the streets of ancient Rome, where hungry citizens lined up for mystery sausages and honey-soaked cheese balls, trusting their stomachs and their ancestors' accumulated wisdom to guide them through another delicious, dangerous meal. And who knows? Maybe those Romans were onto something we've forgotten in our sterile, regulated modern food world. Maybe there's something to be said for eating with adventure, for trusting your instincts over ingredient lists, and for believing that the best meals come from the most unexpected places and the most unlikely combinations of ingredients. After all, they managed to conquer the known world on a diet of fermented fish sauce and questionable sausages. That has to count for something. But we haven't even scratched the surface of Rome's most bizarre snacking habits. Because what we've covered so far was just the mainstream stuff, the everyday foods that kept regular Romans functioning. The truly weird territory was reserved for special occasions, desperate times, and people who had completely abandoned any pretense of culinary sanity. Let's start with what happened when Romans got creative with their leftovers, and I mean really creative. They had an entire philosophy around what they called renewed meals, where yesterday's disasters became today's delicacies through sheer force of seasoning and optimism. That chunk of meat that had developed its own personality. Drown it in garum, add enough pepper to numb your tongue, and suddenly it's a rustic pâté suitable for spreading on bread. But the real artistry came in their approach to what we might diplomatically call enhanced preservation. Romans didn't just accept that food would spoil in Mediterranean heat. They developed techniques for controlling the spoilage process to create flavors that were supposedly superior to fresh ingredients. They would age cuts of meat until they developed crusts hard enough to use as armor, believing that this concentrated the flavors into something approaching perfection. Professional meat vendors would proudly display these aged specimens like fine wines, complete with vintage dates and regional classifications. Customers would actually seek out meat that had achieved particular stages of decomposition, paying premium prices for cuts that had been hanging in stalls for weeks or even months. The theory was that proper aging created complexity and depth that couldn't be achieved through normal cooking methods. The reality was probably closer to controlled biological warfare, but Romans had trained their palates to appreciate these intense, challenging flavors. They developed an entire vocabulary for describing different stages of meat aging, with terms that distinguish between beneficial decomposition and actual danger. Master aged meat vendors could supposedly tell by smell, color, and texture exactly when a cut had reached peak flavor without crossing into genuinely hazardous territory. This expertise extended to their fish markets, where vendors specialized in seafood that had achieved what they called perfect ripeness. Fresh fish was for amateurs and tourists. Sophisticated Romans wanted fish that had developed character, personality, and occasionally the ability to clear entire neighborhoods when the wind shifted. The most prized fish had been aged just long enough to concentrate their oceanic essence without actually achieving independent movement. And then there were the Roman drinking snacks that pushed the boundaries of what could reasonably be called food. They had nuts that had been pickled in solutions so acidic they could probably etch marble. Olives preserved in brines that doubled as industrial cleaning products. Cheese aged until it achieved its own weather systems and could be used to repel invading armies through sheer olfactory assault. These weren't subtle accompaniments to wine. They were flavor nuclear weapons designed to complement equally aggressive Roman drinking culture. A handful of these preserved snacks could completely recalibrate your mouth's chemistry, creating taste experiences that range from transcendent to traumatic, often within the same bite. But perhaps the strangest aspect of Roman snack culture was their seasonal approach to what they called survival foods. During winter months when fresh ingredients were scarce, Romans would break out preserved delicacies that had been prepared during harvest season. But these weren't your grandmother's canned peaches. Romans had developed preservation techniques that transformed familiar foods into completely alien substances. Take their approach to fruit preservation. Dates weren't just dried, they were stuffed with nuts, soaked in honey, and aged until they achieved the consistency of edible gemstones. Grapes weren't just turned into wine. They were fermented into various alcoholic preserves, some of which were solid enough to carve into decorative shapes. Figs were mashed into cakes so dense they could probably deflect arrows. The preparation process for these preserved foods was elaborate and slightly ritualistic. Families would spend entire days preparing their winter food stores, with recipes passed down through generations and closely guarded as family secrets. The results were foods that bore little resemblance to their original ingredients, but could last through multiple seasons while providing essential nutrients and calories. Romans would unveil these preserved treasures during winter festivals, treating them like fine wines or precious artifacts. They had developed an appreciation for the complex flavors that developed during months of controlled aging, fermentation, and what we might generously call transformation. Some of these foods were considered so valuable they were used as gifts, bribes, or diplomatic offerings. Now let's talk about Roman attitudes toward what they called medicinal snacking. Because Romans didn't separate food from medicine the way we do today. They believed that everything you ate had therapeutic properties, and they developed an entire category of snacks that were designed to treat specific ailments while providing entertainment and nutrition. Feeling sluggish? Try some fermented cabbage that had achieved enough acidity to wake the dead. Digestive problems? Have some aged cheese that could double as a biological weapon. Headache from too much wine. Raw garlic cloves eaten whole because apparently Romans believed that if you could survive the garlic, you could survive anything. These medicinal snacks weren't just folk remedies. They were prescribed by actual physicians who had developed elaborate theories about how different flavors and textures affected the body's humoral balance. Roman medical texts contained detailed recipes for therapeutic foods that were supposed to cure everything from lovesickness to plague, though the cure was often more challenging than the original problem. The wealthy had access to exotic medicinal snacks made from imported ingredients and prepared by specialized cooks. Poor Romans made do with local variations that relied more on enthusiasm than expensive components. But both approaches shared the Roman belief that medicine should taste interesting, even if that interest came with considerable risk. Professional medicine snack vendors operated specialized stalls that combined pharmacy with street food, selling treats that promised to cure your ailments while providing enough flavor excitement to distract you from whatever was wrong in the first place. These vendors required special training to understand both the therapeutic properties of their ingredients and the culinary techniques needed to make medicinal foods actually appealing. But the real innovation came in Roman festival foods, where normal dietary restraint was completely abandoned, and vendors competed to create the most outrageous snacks imaginable. During major celebrations, temporary food stalls would appear selling treats that existed nowhere else during the year, confections that pushed every boundary Romans had established for acceptable eating. These weren't just regular street foods with festive decorations. These were specially created delicacies that challenged everything Romans thought they knew about food. Honey-soaked dormice arranged in tiny gladiatorial poses. Sausages stuffed with exotic spices and wrapped in gold leaf for customers who wanted to literally eat money. Cakes shaped like miniature colosseums, complete with edible spectators made from various nuts and dried fruits. Festival vendors would spend months preparing for major celebrations, developing recipes that would create buzz, attract customers, and hopefully avoid killing anyone in the process. The competition was fierce, with successful vendors earning enough during a few days of festivities to support themselves for entire seasons. Innovation was essential because Roman festival goers expected to be surprised, delighted, and occasionally horrified by their food choices. The wealthy would sometimes sponsor elaborate food competitions during festivals, offering substantial prizes for the most creative, most shocking, or most expensive snack. These contests drew vendors from across the empire, creating temporary food fairs that showcased regional specialties and local innovations. Winners could achieve celebrity status and financial security, while losers might find themselves banned from future festivals. And here's where Roman snack culture becomes truly revealing. Their approach to what they called social eating. Romans understood that shared food experiences created bonds between people, and they developed elaborate rituals around communal snacking that were part social bonding, part entertainment, and part survival test. Groups would gather around particularly challenging foods, taking turns attempting to consume items that required skill, courage, and strong stomachs. Successfully navigating a shared meal of questionable sausages and aged delicacies was considered proof of friendship, loyalty, and mutual respect. These weren't casual social gatherings. They were ritualized displays of trust and communal bravery. The foods chosen for these social eating experiences were deliberately challenging. Honey-soaked cheese balls that threatened to glue your mouth shut. Preserved fish so intensely flavored it could induce temporary blindness. Fermented beverages that required careful sipping to avoid immediate regret. The idea was that if you could handle these culinary adventures together, you could handle anything life might throw at your group. Young Romans used these social eating challenges as ways to prove their maturity and earn acceptance into adult society. Successful participation in communal consumption of challenging foods was considered a rite of passage, demonstrating that you had developed both the physical stamina and social sophistication necessary for full Roman citizenship. But perhaps the most surprising aspect of Roman street food culture was how sophisticated their quality control actually was, despite all appearances to the contrary. Recent archaeological discoveries suggest that Romans had developed surprisingly advanced systems for ensuring food safety, even with their seemingly reckless approach to ingredients and preparation. Thermopolia operators had to obtain licenses from local authorities and submit to regular inspections. Vendors were required to display origin information for their ingredients and maintain certain standards of cleanliness. There were established grades for different qualities of garum, with premium versions requiring specific aging processes and ingredient sources. Professional food tasters weren't just employed by paranoid wealthy Romans. They were part of a broader system of quality control that helped ensure street food remained within acceptable bounds of safety. These individuals developed incredible expertise in identifying not just dangerous foods, but also the subtle differences in quality that separated good vendors from mediocre ones. Even the seemingly chaotic Thermopolia had sophisticated supply chains that connected them to farms, fishing operations, and specialized food processors throughout the empire. The apparent randomness of street food offerings was actually the result of complex logistical networks that brought ingredients from thousands of miles away and transformed them into local specialties. Chemical analysis of residues found in Roman cooking vessels reveals that many of those mystery stews were actually nutritionally balanced meals that provided essential vitamins, minerals, and proteins, using whatever ingredients were available and affordable. Those crazy flavor combinations weren't just random experimentation, they were carefully developed recipes designed to create complete nutrition while maximizing taste and satisfaction. The Romans had essentially solved the problem of feeding massive urban populations using ingredients that were often of questionable quality, preparation methods that seemed dangerously unsanitary, and storage techniques that relied more on chemistry than refrigeration. Their success came from understanding fermentation, preservation, and flavor enhancement in ways that allowed them to create genuinely nutritious and appealing foods from materials that other cultures might have discarded. This expertise was passed down through generations of street food vendors who understood not just cooking techniques, but also the science behind food preservation, the psychology of flavor combination, and the economics of urban food distribution. They were culinary engineers disguised as casual snack vendors, solving complex problems through practical experimentation and accumulated wisdom. And here's the final twist that makes Roman junk food culture absolutely fascinating. They were simultaneously more adventurous and more careful than we originally thought. While they were willing to eat things that would terrify modern diners, they had developed sophisticated systems for minimizing actual risk while maximizing flavor adventure. Romans understood that their challenging food culture required knowledge, skill, and community support to work safely. They created educational systems where experienced eaters taught newcomers how to navigate dangerous delicacies. They developed social customs that turned potentially risky eating into communal activities where experienced people could watch out for those who might be in over their heads. The result was a food culture that was simultaneously daring and sustainable, exciting and practical. Romans managed to create street food that was adventurous enough to remain interesting after years of daily consumption, while remaining safe enough to feed an empire without decimating the population through food poisoning. Their legacy isn't just about specific recipes or preparation techniques, though those are fascinating enough. It's about an approach to food that valued adventure over safety, community over individual dining, and flavor intensity over subtle refinement. Romans proved that you could build a sophisticated food culture around ingredients and methods that seemed completely insane, as long as you approach the challenge with enough knowledge, creativity, and mutual support. And perhaps most importantly, they demonstrated that great cuisine doesn't require perfect ingredients, ideal conditions, or foolproof techniques. Sometimes the most memorable food experiences come from the most unlikely combinations of circumstances, ingredients, and people willing to take risks together. So, here's your fun fact to ponder. Recent analysis of ancient Roman teeth has revealed that despite their seemingly crazy diet of fermented fish sauce, aged meats, and mysterious street food, Romans actually had remarkably good dental health and lived longer than most people in the ancient world. Apparently, all that aggressive chewing and intense flavoring actually strengthened their jaws and provided essential nutrients that kept them healthier than populations with more sensible diets. Maybe those Romans knew something about nutrition and food culture that we've forgotten in our modern world of sanitized, standardized, predictable meals. Maybe there's value in eating with adventure, trusting your instincts over ingredient labels, and believing that the best food experiences come from taking calculated risks with people you trust. After all, they conquered most of the known world while snacking on mystery sausages and fermented fish sauce. That has to count for something, right? But what truly separated Roman street food from anything we'd recognize today wasn't just the ingredients or the questionable hygiene. It was their completely unhinged approach to what we might call recreational eating. Romans had turned snacking into a competitive sport, a social ritual, and occasionally a form of public entertainment that could draw crowds larger than gladiator matches. Professional competitive eaters weren't just novelty acts. They were celebrities who traveled from city to city, challenging local champions and putting on shows that combined athletic prowess with what we might generously call digestive daredevilry. These weren't eating contests as we know them today, focused on quantity and speed. Roman food competitions were about surviving the most challenging, dangerous, or disgusting combinations of ingredients while maintaining your dignity and hopefully your consciousness. Champions would specialize in particular categories of culinary torture. Some focused on aged foods, seeing who could consume the most advanced stages of controlled decomposition without visible distress. Others specialized in spice tolerance, working their way through increasingly aggressive combinations of imported peppers and local seasonings until their competitors surrendered or required medical attention from temple physicians. The crowds would place bets on outcomes, cheer for favorites, and sometimes participate in preliminary challenges themselves. Winners could earn substantial prize money, sponsorship deals from wealthy merchants, and celebrity status that lasted for years. Losers might find themselves banned from future competitions, publicly humiliated, or occasionally requiring extended stays at healing temples. But the real entertainment came from the commentary. Romans had developed an entire vocabulary for describing the various stages of competitive food consumption, with terms that distinguish between strategic eating, desperate survival, and complete digestive capitulation. Experienced commentators could analyze an eater's technique, predict their breaking point, and provide running analysis of their physiological responses to increasingly challenging ingredients. These events became elaborate social gatherings that brought together people from every level of Roman society, united by their fascination with the spectacle of competitive consumption and their appreciation for anyone brave enough to risk their digestive system for public entertainment and prize money. Now let's dive into something that would absolutely horrify modern food critics: Roman attitudes toward what they called mystery meat. Street vendors weren't just vague about their ingredients, they were actively secretive, treating their sausage recipes like state secrets and their stew compositions like proprietary military intelligence. The mystery wasn't accidental, it was marketing. Romans had developed a genuine appreciation for culinary suspense, where not knowing exactly what you were eating was part of the appeal. Vendors would compete to create the most intriguing, flavorful, and completely unidentifiable combinations of ingredients, challenging customers to guess what they'd just consumed. Regular customers would develop relationships with particular vendors, based not on knowing what they were getting, but on trusting that whatever surprise awaited them would be worth the risk. It was like a daily lottery where the prizes were measured in flavor intensity, and the risks were calculated in potential digestive consequences. Some vendors became famous for their particularly enigmatic offerings. Marcus the Mysterious might be known for sausages that contained ingredients from 3 different continents and possibly another dimension. Gaius the Gambler specialized in daily specials that changed based on whatever unusual items had fallen off merchant carts or been confiscated from questionable import operations. The wealthy would sometimes hire food investigators to try to reverse engineer their favorite mystery recipes, employing teams of professional tasters and even primitive chemical analysis to decode the secrets behind particularly memorable meals. This created an entire underground economy of culinary espionage, where successful recipes were worth fortunes and trade secrets were guarded more carefully than military strategies. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of Roman mystery meat culture was how it reflected their broader approach to life. They valued surprise over predictability, adventure over safety, and the thrill of the unknown over the comfort of familiar flavors. Romans didn't want their food to be boring, safe, or completely comprehensible. They wanted it to challenge them, surprise them, and create stories worth sharing with friends. And speaking of stories worth sharing, let's talk about Roman drinking snacks and the elaborate social rituals that developed around food specifically designed to be consumed while intoxicated. These weren't just random bar snacks. They were carefully engineered delivery systems for increasingly complex flavors that could hold their own against wine that was often strong enough to strip paint. Romans had figured out that certain combinations of salt, fat, and acidity could actually enhance the effects of alcohol while providing enough sustenance to keep drinkers functional through extended social gatherings. They developed snacks that were simultaneously sobering and intoxicating, designed to extend drinking sessions without completely incapacitating the participants. The most popular drinking foods were deliberately challenging to consume, requiring coordination, attention, and social cooperation that helped regulate alcohol consumption through sheer logistical necessity. Honey-soaked cheese balls that required careful handling to avoid creating sticky disasters. Pickled delicacies so intensely flavored they demanded immediate wine chasers. Preserved meats so chewy they provided extended chewing entertainment that slowed down drinking pace. But the real innovation came in their approach to what they called progressive snacking. Romans had developed elaborate sequences of foods designed to be consumed in specific orders throughout extended drinking sessions. They understood that different flavors could enhance or moderate alcohol's effects at different stages of intoxication, creating carefully orchestrated dining experiences that could last for hours without completely destroying the participants. Professional party planners would design custom snack progressions for wealthy clients, creating multi-course drinking experiences that told stories through food, built social bonds through shared culinary challenges, and somehow managed to keep everyone conscious enough to participate in conversations about politics, philosophy, and whose gladiator would win next week's matches. These weren't casual drinking sessions. They were elaborate social rituals where food played a crucial role in maintaining group dynamics, facilitating conversation, and ensuring that participants remained functional enough to make it home safely, or at least find appropriate doorways to collapse in. Now let's venture into truly bizarre territory. Roman attitudes toward what they called seasonal adjustment foods. Because Romans didn't just eat differently in winter versus summer, they had developed elaborate theories about how your body's needs changed throughout the year and how food could help you adapt to seasonal challenges. Summer foods were designed to cool the body and provide energy for working in Mediterranean heat, but these weren't refreshing salads or light meals. Romans believed that intensely salty, highly fermented foods would help regulate body temperature and prevent heat exhaustion. They would consume pickled vegetables so acidic they could probably etch stone, believing that this acidity would balance their internal humors and keep them functional during the hottest months. Winter foods were supposed to warm the body and provide sustained energy for colder weather. This meant aged meats that had developed enough concentrated protein to fuel extended physical activity, fermented beverages that provided internal heating, and preserved fruits so dense with calories they could probably power small machinery. But the transition foods were where things got really weird. Romans had developed specific snacks designed to help your body adjust to changing seasons. Foods that were supposed to gradually shift your internal chemistry from summer mode to winter mode, and back again. These transition snacks often combined ingredients from different seasons in ways that created completely new flavor profiles. Spring transition foods might combine preserved winter ingredients with the first fresh herbs and vegetables, creating dishes that were simultaneously familiar and shocking. Fall transition foods would blend summer's fresh produce with winter's preserved delicacies, producing combinations that challenged both your palate and your digestive system's seasonal expectations. Professional seasonal food consultants would work with wealthy families to design custom dietary transitions that would optimize health, energy, and social standing throughout the year. These consultants understood not just nutrition and flavor, but also the social significance of eating seasonally appropriate foods and the political implications of being seen consuming the right ingredients at the right times. But the most fascinating aspect of Roman seasonal eating was how it created a food culture that was constantly changing, always offering something new to look forward to, and deeply connected to natural rhythms that urban life might otherwise obscure. Romans didn't just endure seasonal changes. They celebrated them through elaborate food rituals that marked the passage of time and connected them to agricultural cycles that sustain that would their civilization. And here's something probably amaze modern nutritionists. Recent analysis of Roman skeletal remains suggests that despite their seemingly chaotic approach to food safety and their willingness to consume ingredients that would hospitalize modern diners, Romans actually had remarkably diverse and nutritionally complete diets. Their street food culture, with all its apparent randomness and risk-taking, was actually providing essential nutrients, vitamins, and minerals that many Romans couldn't have obtained through more conventional dietary approaches. Those mystery stews weren't just random ingredients thrown together. They were unconsciously balanced meals that provided complete nutrition using whatever was available, affordable, and in season. The fermentation processes that made Roman food seem so extreme were actually creating probiotics, preserving vitamins, and enhancing nutrient absorption in ways that supported digestive health and immune function. Their aggressive use of herbs and spices wasn't just about flavor. It was providing antimicrobial protection and therapeutic compounds that helped prevent illness and promote healing. Even their seemingly reckless approach to aged and preserved foods was based on sophisticated understanding of controlled fermentation, beneficial bacteria, and the transformation of raw ingredients into more digestible and nutritious forms. Romans had essentially developed a street food culture that was simultaneously adventurous and scientifically sound, even if they didn't understand the biochemistry behind their success. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery is that Romans had figured out how to create a food system that could adapt quickly to changing conditions, supply disruptions, and economic challenges while maintaining both nutritional value and cultural meaning. Their street food vendors were essentially solving complex logistical and nutritional problems in real time, using creativity, accumulated wisdom, and willingness to experiment with whatever materials were available. This adaptability was crucial to Roman success, allowing their civilization to expand across diverse climates and regions while maintaining cultural coherence through shared food experiences. Whether you were eating mystery stew in Britain or honey-soaked cheese balls in Egypt, you were participating in a food culture that connected you to millions of other Romans who shared your appreciation for culinary adventure and your willingness to trust your stomach to questionable but somehow satisfying street food. And here's your mind-blowing final fact. Recent archaeological analysis of Thermopolia in Pompeii has revealed that these ancient fast food joints were actually more sophisticated than many modern restaurants. They had specialized equipment for temperature control, elaborate supply chain management systems, and even primitive forms of quality assurance that ensured customers got consistently good food despite the apparent chaos. The volcanic ash that preserved Pompeii also preserved detailed evidence of Roman street food culture at its peak, including actual meals that were being prepared when Vesuvius erupted. Chemical analysis of these preserved foods reveals that Roman street vendors were creating genuinely delicious, nutritionally balanced, and surprisingly safe meals using ingredients and techniques that seemed completely insane, but were actually based on centuries of accumulated expertise. Those Romans weren't just lucky survivors of their own culinary recklessness. They were sophisticated food scientists who had figured out how to turn apparent chaos into systematic success, creating a street food culture that fed an empire while providing entertainment, social bonding, and the kind of memorable dining experiences that people still talk about 2,000 years later. So the next time you're wondering whether to trust that sketchy food truck or questioning the wisdom of trying something completely unfamiliar, remember that you're participating in a tradition that helped build one of history's most successful civilizations. Sometimes the best meals come from taking calculated risks with people you trust, and sometimes the most unlikely ingredients create the most unforgettable flavors. The Romans proved that great food culture isn't about perfect conditions or predictable results. It's about curiosity, creativity, community, and the willingness to believe that today's mystery sausage might just be tomorrow's legendary meal. And honestly, given how well it worked for them, maybe we could all learn something from their approach to eating with adventure, trusting our instincts, and never being afraid to try something that might surprise us. After all, they conquered most of the known world while snacking on fermented fish sauce and questionable street meat. That kind of success has to be worth at least considering their methods, even if we draw the line at dormice and aged cheese that can clear neighborhoods. But the most Roman thing of all might be how they dealt with what we'd call breakfast on the go. Because in a city where most people lived in cramped apartments without proper cooking facilities, the morning rush to grab something edible before heading to work, the markets, or the public baths, was as chaotic as anything we see today. Romans didn't have coffee shops, but they had something arguably more intense: wine bars that opened before dawn, serving what they called morning wine mixed with honey and spices. This wasn't social drinking. This was fuel for facing another day in the empire, and to soak up that morning wine, pieces of bread that had been soaked in the stuff overnight, creating a breakfast that was part meal, part hangover cure, and part liquid courage. Street vendors would set up before sunrise, offering what we might recognize as the world's first breakfast burritos. Except instead of tortillas, they used flatbread stuffed with whatever protein had survived the night. Leftover sausage, chunks of cheese that hadn't completely hardened, maybe some pickled vegetables for crunch. The whole thing would be drizzled with olive oil and garum, because apparently Romans believed that fermented fish sauce improved everything, including your ability to function before the sun came up. But here's where Roman breakfast culture gets truly bizarre. They had developed an entire category of foods specifically designed to be eaten while walking to work. These weren't just portable snacks. They were engineered solutions to the problem of eating while navigating crowded streets, dodging carts, and trying not to trip over the various animals, people, and mysterious substances that littered Roman roadways. Honey-fried dough balls were perfect for this because they came on sticks, like ancient corn dogs, except the stick was edible too. Romans would eat the whole thing, stick and all, because wasting food was expensive and littering was apparently not yet socially unacceptable. The honey coating prevented the food from falling apart in your hands, while the fried dough provided enough carbohydrates to power whatever manual labor awaited you. And then there were the Romans who took portability to extremes with their invention of what we might call edible packaging. Instead of wrapping food in leaves or cloth, creative vendors would create containers made entirely of hardened bread or cheese. You'd buy your stew or porridge served in a bowl made of stale bread, eat the contents, then eat the bowl. Nothing wasted, nothing to carry home. And if you were still hungry, you could probably find someone selling bowls made of different types of bread, with completely different flavor profiles. This edible packaging revolution extended to drinking vessels too. Romans developed cups made from various hardened dairy products that would gradually dissolve as you drank, flavoring your wine or water while providing additional calories. The wealthy had cups made from aged cheeses that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The poor made do with cups fashioned from whatever dairy products were approaching their expiration dates, which sometimes led to drinking experiences that were more adventure than refreshment. But perhaps the most uniquely Roman approach to street food was their relationship with what they called competitive seasoning. Vendors didn't just flavor their food, they waged flavor wars against each other, trying to create the most intense, memorable, and occasionally dangerous taste experiences possible. Some specialized in heat, using imported peppers and local spices to create dishes that could induce temporary blindness, but supposedly promoted health and vitality. Others focused on salt, creating preserved foods so intensely briny they could be used to de-ice roads, but were somehow considered delicacies by people with sufficiently trained palates. The most ambitious vendors specialized in what we might call flavor complexity, creating dishes that combined sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami in combinations that shouldn't have worked, but somehow created taste experiences that were genuinely transcendent. These weren't accidents. They were the result of generations of accumulated knowledge about how different flavors interacted and reinforced each other. Professional flavor consultants would work with wealthy clients to design custom spice blends and seasoning combinations that reflected their social status, regional origins, and personal preferences. These consultants understood not just cooking, but also the social significance of different flavor profiles and the political implications of being associated with particular seasoning traditions. And here's something that would probably fascinate modern food scientists. Romans had developed sophisticated understanding of what we now call flavor pairing, creating combinations of ingredients that enhanced each other's natural characteristics in ways that modern molecular gastronomy is just beginning to explore systematically. They knew that certain aged cheeses would complement specific types of honey in ways that created entirely new flavor experiences. They understood that particular fermentation processes could transform ordinary vegetables into complex wine-like substances that paired perfectly with certain types of preserved meats. They had figured out how to use controlled decomposition and strategic aging to create flavor compounds that couldn't be achieved through normal cooking methods. But the real innovation came in their approach to what they called social flavoring. Romans understood that food tasted different when shared with others, and they developed dishes designed to be consumed in groups, with flavors that revealed themselves differently, depending on who you were eating with and what kind of conversation was happening. Some foods were designed to promote bonding, with mild flavors that encouraged sharing and collaboration. Others were deliberately challenging, requiring group cooperation to consume safely and creating shared experiences that strengthened social connections. The most sophisticated dishes were designed to facilitate specific types of conversation, with flavor profiles that supposedly enhanced political discussion, romantic interaction, or philosophical debate. This social flavoring philosophy extended to their approach to dining etiquette, which wasn't just about proper behavior, but about optimizing the communal food experience. Romans had developed elaborate protocols for sharing challenging foods, with specific techniques for distributing risk, managing mess, and ensuring that everyone participated appropriately in whatever culinary adventure the group had chosen to undertake. Professional social dining consultants would design custom eating experiences for wealthy clients, creating meals that would facilitate specific types of social interaction while demonstrating the host's sophistication, generosity, and understanding of proper Roman hospitality customs. But what really made Roman street food culture remarkable wasn't just its creativity or intensity, it was its incredible resilience. This was a food system that could adapt to war, famine, economic collapse, and natural disasters while continuing to feed millions of people with enough variety and flavor to maintain morale and cultural identity. When traditional supply lines were disrupted, Roman street vendors would innovate with local alternatives, creating new dishes that maintained familiar flavors using completely different ingredients. When imported spices became unavailable, they would develop substitute blends using local herbs and creative fermentation processes. When meat became scarce, they would create protein alternatives using nuts, legumes, and dairy products that were nutritionally equivalent and often more flavorful than the original options. This adaptability wasn't just practical, it was creative. Roman street food culture thrived on change, challenge, and the need to constantly innovate within constraints. Vendors who could create delicious meals using whatever materials were available earned reputations that, while those who rely could last for generations, those too heavily on specific ingredients often found themselves out of business when circumstances changed. The result was a food culture that was simultaneously traditional and revolutionary, maintaining core Roman flavor profiles while constantly evolving to meet new challenges and take advantage of new opportunities. Street vendors were essentially conducting continuous culinary experiments, testing new combinations and techniques with customers who were willing to pay for the privilege of participating in food innovation. And here's your final mind-bending fact. Recent analysis of ancient Roman coins has revealed that many of them contain traces of garum, honey, and various spices, suggesting that Romans were so committed to their intense food culture that they were literally handling money that had been flavored by their meals. When you're paying for your mystery sausage with coins that already taste like fermented fish sauce, you've achieved a level of culinary commitment that borders on the philosophical. The Romans didn't just eat their food, they lived it, breathed it, and apparently even counted it. Their entire civilization was marinated in the flavors of their street food culture, creating a society where the line between sustenance and identity had completely dissolved. Every meal was an adventure, every snack was a statement, and every bite was a reminder that in Rome, food wasn't just fuel for the body, it was fuel for the soul, the economy, and the endless Roman appetite for experiences that were simultaneously practical and completely, gloriously insane. So the next time you're debating whether to try that questionable food truck, or wondering if you're brave enough to order something you can't pronounce, just remember that you're participating in a tradition that goes back over 2,000 years. The Romans proved that the best food adventures happen when you're willing to trust your taste buds, embrace the unknown, and maybe, just maybe, discover that today's mystery meal might become tomorrow's legendary dining experience. After all, they conquered the known world one fermented fish sauce-soaked snack at a time. That kind of success doesn't happen by accident. It happens by being brave enough to eat with adventure and never, ever underestimating the power of really good street food to change the course of history. And perhaps that's the most remarkable thing about Roman street food culture. It wasn't just about feeding people quickly and cheaply. It was about creating a shared experience that transcended social boundaries, where a senator and a slave could find themselves standing side by side, both wrestling with the same honey-glazed cheese ball and both equally likely to end up with sticky fingers and bee-related complications. The democratic nature of Roman snacking extended beyond just who could afford what. It was about shared risk, shared adventure, and the peculiarly Roman belief that life was meant to be lived boldly, even when that boldness involved trusting your digestive system to unknown vendors with questionable hygiene standards and creative approaches to food safety. But let's talk about something that really captures the essence of Roman street food philosophy: their approach to what we might call backup meals. Romans understood that not every culinary experiment would be successful, and they developed an entire category of emergency foods designed to rescue you when your first choice turned out to be either inedible or potentially lethal. Enter the humble but heroic flatbread, Rome's answer to edible insurance. These weren't the artisanal, carefully crafted breads we might imagine. Roman flatbreads were dense, durable, and designed to survive whatever abuse Roman daily life might inflict upon them. They could be stuffed with whatever protein hadn't achieved independent movement, drizzled with olive oil that might be several months past its prime, and seasoned with enough salt to preserve them through minor apocalypses. The beauty of Roman flatbread was its versatility. Too drunk to navigate complex foods, flatbread could handle simple toppings and straightforward consumption. Broke and desperate, flatbread was cheap enough that even the most impoverished citizen could afford something resembling a meal. In a hurry and can't stop to sit down. Flatbread was portable enough to eat while running through the streets, dodging carts, and avoiding whatever substances were flowing through Roman gutters. But Romans being Romans, they found ways to make even emergency backup food into an art form. Street vendors would specialize in flatbread combinations that pushed the boundaries of what seemed advisable to eat. Some would layer on preserved meats that had achieved their own weather systems. Others would add vegetables that had been pickled until they could probably dissolve metal. The most ambitious would create flatbread sandwiches that combined multiple questionable ingredients into single packages of concentrated culinary danger. And then there were the Romans who took their backup meal philosophy to truly excessive lengths with their development of what they called survival snacks. These weren't just foods that could get you through tough times. They were engineered solutions to the problem of eating when civilization had temporarily broken down around you. Roman survival snacks had to meet impossible criteria. They needed to be nutritious enough to sustain manual labor, durable enough to survive transport in harsh conditions, flavorful enough to maintain morale, and stable enough to last through extended storage without refrigeration or preservatives beyond salt and hope. The solutions they developed would impress modern military ration designers and terrify contemporary food safety experts. Take their approach to what we might call concentrated protein. Romans would take various meats, age them until they achieved maximum density, then grind them into pastes that could be formed into portable blocks. These protein blocks were so concentrated that a piece the size of your thumb could supposedly provide enough nutrition for an entire day of heavy labor. They were also so intensely flavored that eating them required careful preparation and considerable courage. The wealthy would have these protein blocks made from premium ingredients, carefully aged and flavored with expensive spices. The poor would make do with versions created from whatever meat-like substances were available and affordable. But both versions shared the Roman commitment to creating foods that were simultaneously practical and challenging to consume. Storage was handled through techniques that combined controlled dehydration with strategic salt application. Romans would wrap these concentrated foods in materials that were themselves edible, creating layered packages where the wrapping provided additional nutrition and flavor. Nothing was wasted, everything served multiple purposes, and the entire system was designed to function even when normal supply chains had completely collapsed. But the real innovation came in their approach to what they called morale foods. Romans understood that surviving difficult times wasn't just about getting enough calories, it was about maintaining the psychological state necessary to continue functioning under stress. They developed specific snacks designed to provide emotional comfort, along with physical sustenance. These morale foods often incorporated ingredients that were associated with better times or special occasions. A bit of honey to remind you of festival days. Some imported spices that recalled more prosperous periods. Flavors that connected you to family traditions or regional identities that helped maintain your sense of self, even when everything else was falling apart. Professional morale food consultants would work with military units, traveling merchants, and wealthy families to design custom survival food packages that would maintain both physical and emotional health during extended difficult periods. These consultants understood not preservation, but also the psychology, just nutrition, of eating under stress, and the social dynamics of sharing limited food supplies. Now let's venture into territory that would make modern health inspectors reach for their emergency whistles. Roman attitudes toward what they called experimental preservation. Because Romans didn't just accept that food would spoil in Mediterranean heat, they developed techniques for controlling and directing the spoilage process to create entirely new categories of edible substances. They had figured out that certain types of controlled decomposition could actually improve both flavor and nutritional value. Vegetables that were allowed to ferment under specific conditions would develop complex flavor profiles that couldn't be achieved through normal cooking. Meats that were aged using particular techniques would become more digestible and develop concentrated tastes that were genuinely superior to fresh alternatives. But this wasn't just random experimentation. Romans had developed sophisticated understanding of fermentation science. Even if they couldn't explain the biochemistry behind their success, they knew which combinations of salt, temperature, and time would produce beneficial results and which would create genuine dangers. They understood how to control bacterial growth to encourage helpful fermentation while preventing harmful contamination. Master preservation specialists would guard their techniques like state secrets, passing knowledge down through generations of apprentices who learned not just recipes, but the subtle signs that indicated when fermentation was proceeding correctly or veering into dangerous territory. These specialists could predict with remarkable accuracy how different foods would respond to various preservation treatments, and how long the results would remain safe and palatable. The wealthy would compete to the services obtained of the most skilled preservation masters, commissioning custom-preserved foods that demonstrated both their wealth and their sophisticated understanding of advanced culinary techniques. These preserved delicacies would be served at dinner parties, like fine wines, with guests expected to appreciate the subtle flavors and complex aging processes that had created them. But even common Romans had access to basic preservation techniques that allowed them to transform everyday ingredients into more interesting and durable foods. Street vendors would offer preserved snacks that had been prepared using family recipes and traditional methods, creating affordable luxuries that brought sophisticated flavors within reach of ordinary citizens. And here's something that reveals the true sophistication of Roman food culture. They had developed elaborate social protocols around the sharing of preserved and aged foods. These weren't just eating experiences. They were social rituals that demonstrated trust, friendship, and mutual respect. Offering someone a taste of your carefully aged cheese or preserved meat was a gesture of hospitality that carried significant social weight. Accepting such an offer meant you trusted both the giver's judgment and their preparation techniques. Successfully consuming challenging preserved foods together created bonds that could last for years and established reputations for courage and sophistication. Professional social dining consultants would design elaborate sharing experiences around preserved foods, creating multi-course tastings that told stories about regional traditions, family histories, and seasonal cycles. These events weren't just meals, they were cultural education experiences that helped maintain connections to Roman traditions and values. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Roman preservation culture was how it created a food system that could adapt to changing conditions while maintaining cultural continuity. When fresh ingredients became unavailable, Romans could fall back on preserved alternatives that maintained familiar flavors and nutritional profiles. When economic conditions changed, preservation techniques allowed people to transform cheaper ingredients into more appealing and satisfying foods. This adaptability was crucial to Roman success in expanding across diverse climates and regions. Roman preservation techniques could work with local ingredients to create foods that maintained Roman flavor profiles while incorporating regional characteristics. This allowed Roman culture to spread and adapt without losing its essential identity. Now here's something that would probably amaze modern urban planners. Romans had developed sophisticated distribution systems that could deliver fresh and preserved foods to millions of people living in dense urban environments without modern refrigeration or transportation infrastructure. The Thermopolia network wasn't just random food stalls scattered around cities. It was a carefully planned system that ensured every neighborhood had access to affordable walking distance. Nutritious food within vendors were strategically located to serve different populations at different times of day, creating a distribution network that could handle the complex logistics of feeding massive urban populations. Supply chains connected these urban food vendors to farms, fishing operations, and specialized food processors throughout the empire. Ingredients would travel thousands of miles, undergo various preservation and preparation processes, and still arrive at street-level vendors in condition to create satisfying meals for ordinary citizens. The economic impact was staggering. The Roman street food industry employed millions of people in roles ranging from ingredient production to final sale, creating economic opportunities for everyone from farmers to specialized food artisans. The system generated enough wealth to support not just the vendors themselves, but entire networks of suppliers, transporters, and support services. But the real achievement was social. Roman street food culture created shared experiences that helped bind together one of history's most diverse empires. Whether you were eating honey-soaked pastries in Gaul or fermented fish sauce-flavored snacks in Egypt, you were participating in a food culture that connected you to millions of other Romans who shared your appreciation for bold flavors and culinary adventure. This cultural continuity was maintained through food traditions that traveled with Roman expansion, adapted to local conditions, and created hybrid cuisines that were simultaneously Roman and regional. Street food vendors became cultural ambassadors, spreading Roman values and traditions through the universal language of shared meals and memorable flavors. And here's your mind-blowing final revelation. Recent archaeological analysis of ancient Roman sewage systems has revealed that Romans were consuming a more diverse and nutritionally complete diet than most modern urban populations. Their seemingly chaotic street food culture was actually providing better nutrition than many contemporary diets, with more variety, more probiotics, and more essential nutrients than people living in much more controlled food environments. The fermentation processes that made Roman food seem so extreme were creating beneficial bacteria that supported digestive health and immune function. Their aggressive use of herbs and spices was providing antimicrobial protection and therapeutic compounds that helped prevent illness and promote healing. Even their willingness to eat challenging and unusual foods was exposing them to a broader range of nutrients and developing stronger immune systems. Roman street food vendors weren't just feeding people, they were inadvertently conducting one of history's most successful public health experiments. They proved that food culture based on diversity, fermentation, and boldness could support larger, healthier populations than more cautious approaches to eating. So here's your takeaway that might just change how you think about food forever. Those Romans with their mystery sausages, fermented fish sauce, and questionable preservation techniques weren't reckless party animals who got lucky. They were sophisticated food scientists who had figured out how to create a sustainable, healthy, and incredibly successful food culture using ingredients and methods that seem insane, but were actually based on profound understanding of nutrition, fermentation, and community building. They conquered most of the known world while eating street food that would terrify modern health inspectors, and they did it by embracing adventure over safety, community over individual dining, and bold flavors over predictable meals. Maybe there's something we can learn from their approach to eating with courage, trusting our instincts, and believing that the best food experiences come from taking calculated risks with people we trust. After all, when your civilization's street food culture is sophisticated enough to accidentally create better nutrition than modern processed foods, you might be onto something that's worth paying attention to, even 2,000 years later. But the truly wild part about Roman street food culture wasn't just what they ate or how they prepared it. It was their complete and utter disregard for what we'd consider basic food safety, combined with an almost mystical faith in their digestive systems. Romans had developed what we might call strategic ignorance about their food supply, where not asking too many questions was considered a survival skill. Take the average Roman worker heading to the construction site for another day of hauling marble blocks. He'd stop at his favourite thermopolium, point at whatever was bubbling in the nearest pot, and hand over his coins without a single inquiry about ingredients, preparation time, or the last time that ladle had been properly cleaned. This wasn't carelessness, it was practical wisdom. In a world where your other breakfast option might be stale bread and questionable water, mystery stew started to look like a reasonable life choice. The vendors understood this implicit contract perfectly. They weren't selling transparency or detailed ingredient lists. They were selling hot food that would keep you functional until evening. The mystery was part of the value proposition. You weren't just buying calories. You were buying the thrill of culinary roulette and the satisfaction of surviving whatever combination of ingredients had ended up in that particular pot. But here's where Roman street food gets genuinely fascinating from a social perspective. The same foods that sustained labourers and slaves were also consumed by wealthy Romans who could afford anything they wanted. This wasn't slumming or social experimentation. It was genuine appreciation for flavours and techniques that couldn't be replicated in formal kitchens. Rich Romans would disguise themselves and venture into the grittiest neighbourhoods, not to mock the poor, but to access food that was somehow more authentic, more intense, and more satisfying than anything their trained cooks could produce. They understood that the best sausage makers weren't necessarily working in marble-columned establishments, and that the most skilled thermopolium operators had developed techniques that formal cuisine couldn't match. This created a unique food democracy where social boundaries temporarily dissolved around shared appreciation for well-prepared street food. A senator might find himself elbow to elbow with a dock worker, both waiting for the same vendor's legendary fried chickpeas, both equally willing to risk dental damage for that perfect combination of salt, crunch, and nostalgic satisfaction. The wealthy would even import street food techniques into their private dining, hiring former thermopolium cooks to recreate street flavours in more controlled environments. But somehow, the food never tasted quite the same when removed from its chaotic, slightly dangerous original context. Romans seemed to understand instinctively that great street food required an element of risk, uncertainty, and communal adventure that couldn't be sanitized or domesticated. Now let's dive into something that would make modern food scientists weep with either admiration or horror: Roman fermentation culture. Because when Romans discovered that controlled decomposition could create entirely new categories of flavors, they didn't just dabble in the technique, they turned it into an art form that bordered on the mystical. Their relationship with fermentation went far beyond the famous garum fish sauce. Romans were fermenting everything they could get their hands on, creating a parallel universe of foods that had been transformed through time, bacteria, and what can biological only be described as controlled warfare against bland flavors. Vegetables weren't just pickled, they were fermented until they developed complex ecosystems of flavors that could change and evolve over months of careful aging. Cabbage would be packed in salt and left to develop into something that was simultaneously sour, salty, and explosively flavorful. Turnips would be fermented until they achieved a pungency that could clear rooms, but somehow tasted incredible when paired with the right wines and consumed by people with sufficiently trained palates. The fermentation masters were like ancient biochemists, understanding through pure experimentation and accumulated wisdom how to control bacterial growth, manage temperature and humidity, and create conditions that would produce beneficial transformation rather than dangerous contamination. They could predict with remarkable accuracy how different vegetables would respond to various fermentation treatments and how long the results would remain at peak flavor. But the real artistry came in their fermented grain products. Romans had discovered that certain grains, when allowed to ferment under specific conditions, would develop into substances that were part bread, part alcoholic beverage, and part probiotic health food. These fermented grain porridges were thick, slightly alcoholic, and packed with beneficial bacteria that supported digestive health in ways Romans couldn't scientifically understand, but definitely experienced. Street vendors would sell fermented grain products that had been bubbling away in their stalls for days or weeks, developing flavors that changed daily as the fermentation progressed. Regular customers would time their visits to catch their preferred stage of fermentation, whether they preferred the mild, sweet early stages or the intensely sour, slightly alcoholic later phases. And then there were the Romans who pushed fermentation into truly experimental territory with their development of what we might call accelerated aging techniques. Instead of waiting months or years for natural aging processes, innovative food artisans developed methods for speeding up fermentation using controlled heat, strategic air exposure, and various catalytic substances that could compress months of aging into weeks of intensive processing. These accelerated fermentation techniques were closely guarded trade secrets, passed down through generations of specialists who understood the precise conditions needed to achieve rapid transformation without creating dangerous contamination. The results were foods that had all the complexity and intensity of naturally aged products, but could be produced quickly enough to meet the demands of urban street food markets. Professional accelerated fermentation specialists would work with wealthy clients to create custom-aged foods that demonstrated both sophistication and cutting-edge culinary technology. These foods were simultaneously ancient and revolutionary, maintaining traditional Roman flavor profiles, while incorporating innovations that pushed the boundaries of what seemed possible with available ingredients and techniques. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Roman fermentation culture was how it created foods that were actually healthier and more nutritious than their fresh alternatives. The fermentation process was breaking down complex compounds into more digestible forms, creating beneficial bacteria that supported immune function and developing nutrients that weren't present in the original ingredients. Modern analysis of preserved Roman fermented foods reveals that these products were providing probiotics, enhanced vitamin absorption, and antimicrobial compounds that help prevent illness and promote overall health. Romans had accidentally created functional foods that were simultaneously delicious and therapeutic, supporting both immediate satisfaction and long-term well-being. Now let's talk about something that perfectly captures the Roman approach to balancing practicality with pure insanity, their development of edible serving containers. Because why use plates and bowls that you have to wash when you can make your containers out of food and eat everything when you're done? Roman street vendors had perfected the art of creating serving vessels from hardened bread, aged cheese, and various other edible materials that could hold hot liquids, support substantial weight, and provide additional flavor and nutrition once you'd finished the main course. This wasn't just environmental consciousness, it was economic genius wrapped in culinary creativity. So there you have it, the gloriously chaotic world of Roman junk food, where mystery sausages fueled an empire and fermented fish sauce was considered a food group. These weren't just random snacks, they were the backbone of urban civilization, feeding millions while somehow creating better nutrition than many modern diets. The Romans proved that great food culture isn't about perfect ingredients or sterile conditions. It's about boldness, community, and the willingness to turn every meal into an adventure. Next time you're debating that sketchy food truck, remember you're participating in a tradition that helped conquer the known world, one questionable but surprisingly delicious bite at a time.